He was told, apparently, that he was being arrested for a 48-hour investigative detention. There were initial reports that he was arrested for not producing identification to a law enforcement officer. We've seen other reports that said he was arrested for suspicious behavior in a courthouse. A sheriff's captain told that to Josh Marshall, the editor at Talking Points Memo today. But in any case, they arrested him. The guy's out now, but here's like my sort of like the favorite little grace note for me in this whole story. After they arrested the congressional candidate's field director, reportedly after confirming with him that he worked for a Democratic campaign specifically, after they arrested him and they held him and then they finally let him out, even after they finally let him out, they kept his phone. He is the field director for the Democratic congressional candidate in that district, and the election is less than a month away. Now local law enforcement has confiscated his phone for the crime of handing over a letter trying to make sure that local students at the local black college can vote this time. Happy 2018. I know it feels like your TV set should be in black and white, so I'm telling this story, but no, this is us now. Joining us now is Mike Siegel, Democratic congressional candidate, and his field director, Jacob Aronowitz, who was arrested yesterday. Mr. Siegel, Mr. Aronowitz, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I appreciate you both making the time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're really glad for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rachel.
Jacob, I know I'm going to say this as both a thank you and a caveat. I have been advised that you have been awake for well over 24 hours and that you're in a little bit of physical distress at this point because of what you have been through. I'd want to thank you for making time given those circumstances and just ask you what you have been through over the last day or so. What actually have you been through?
Well, your recounting of events was accurate. I was arrested and held at the Waller County Sheriff's Jail, and the phone was taken, was confiscated, and at the time of its confiscation, they said they were going to seek a warrant to go through its contents, and that didn't happen. And I did get the phone back earlier today, but the experience was harrowing, and well, it made me reflect on what people in that county deal with on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis.
Mr. Siegel, I understand from reporting both in the Houston Chronicle and from Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo that you apparently were on the phone with Jacob while he was being detained and basically up until the point where he was arrested, essentially conferring with him and trying to advise him through this process. What was that like for you?
At first, I thought it was a joke, you know, that they were just going to ask him a couple questions and let him go. But as it continued further and further and more law enforcement officials arrived, I think by the end, Jacob was surrounded by 7 or more deputies and police officers. I realized that, you know, we are in a different place. You know, I'm lucky enough to live in Austin, Texas, and we don't face this kind of repression on a day-to-day basis. But the idea that a simple taking of a picture of delivering a letter would end up being kept in custody for 2 hours, and you know they put their hands on Jacob, they wouldn't let him go, they threatened to hold him for multiple days. I was horrified that they would do this to someone for the simple act of delivering a letter.
And what's the status of the students who were the subject of that letter? I ran through a little bit of the history of Prairie View A&M. Honestly, I could do a week-long series about that history because it is such an important thing in American civil rights and what those students have been up against, what they've fought for, what they continue to have to fight for is a heck of a saga in American voting rights and civil rights. But Mike, what's the status right now in terms of whether or not these potentially thousands of voters at Prairie View A&M are going to be able to cast their votes without any hassle on Election Day?
Well, we're hopeful that through shining a light on this issue, that we can achieve the objective of having all the students' voting status restored and taking away this impediment where they're being asked to fill out additional papers, which will, of course, lengthen the wait for voting and would discourage some students from voting. But I'm just really thankful that I'm able to use my campaign to shine light on this issue, this historic issue that you've outlined. I mean, there are so many women of color, African-American leaders in that community who have been fighting for voting rights for decades. And so the fact that we can use this campaign to shine a light on what's happening in Waller County gives me a little bit of encouragement. I think big picture, we're going to have to continue to negotiate with Waller County, with the county judge, to get them to reverse their decision. One thing you didn't note, Rachel, was that they just announced this decision 2 weeks before the close of voter registration. So on September 26th is when they announced at a meeting that they were going to change the way they perceived the voting status of the students. And so really this is this very late change to the voting status, and it's something that would not be allowed under the previous version of the Voting Rights Act. You know, Texas used to be in pre-clearance, and this is something that, because it's an impediment to voting, wouldn't have been allowed but for that recent Supreme Court decision that invalidated part of the Voting Rights Act.
Right. Specifically, Waller County used to have to prove to the Justice Department that if they were making any change in their policies or practices around election, they'd have to prove that it wasn't either intended to or going to have the effect of racial discrimination. Now, since the conservative majority on the Supreme Court killed the Voting Rights Act, gutted that part of it, they no longer have to make that proof. I'll ask you just one last question before you go, and this is actually for Jacob. Jacob, there's been reporting that you, before you were arrested, you were specifically asked whether the candidate or what party the candidate was whose campaign you were working for. I just want to confirm with you whether or not that actually happened. I think that struck a lot of people around the country as a sort of a shocking part of this, that you were asked what party Mr. Siegel was before you were arrested. Is that true?
Yeah, that is accurate. And Mr. Siegel, Mike was on the phone, on speakerphone, and he heard the question asked as well. And honestly, that might have been one of the most chilling parts of the entire encounter, because there's like, I mean, it's pretty clear where someone's coming from when they ask you a question like that.
Yeah, especially when they follow it up by arresting you.
Exactly, exactly. It was a very, very chilling question. And as I said, Mike heard it too, so I can definitely confirm that.
Democratic congressional candidate Mike Siegel is running against Michael McCall, Republican incumbent in Texas. Campaign field director Jacob Aronowitz. Jacob, I hope you get some sleep. Thanks for making time, both of us, to talk us through this. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it.
Much more ahead tonight. Do stay with us.